Chapter 1. Hold her head. That's it, lad. The mare, her normally white coat grey with sweat, rolled her eyes and whickered. Prince Arthas Manethil, only son to King Taranis Manethil II, one day to rule the kingdom of Lordaeron, held fast to the bridle and murmured soothingly. The horse jerked her head violently and almost took the 9-year-old with her. "Whoa, bright mare," Arthas said. "Easy, girl. It'll be all right. Nothing to worry about." Joram Balnir grunted in amusement. "Doubt you'd feel the same way if something that size of this foal was coming out of you, lad." His son, Jarim, crouched beside his father and the prince, laughed, and so did Arthas, giggling uncontrollably, even as hot and soggy foam from Brightmane's champing mouth dropped onto his leg. "One more push, girl," Balnir said, moving slowly along the horse's body to where the foal, encased in a slimy shroud-like membrane, was halfway through its journey into the world. Arthas wasn't really supposed to be here, but when he had no lessons, he often sneaked away to the Balnir farmstead to admire the horses Balnir was known for breeding and to play with his friend Jarim. Both youths were well aware that a horse breeder's son, even one whose animals were regularly bought as mounts for the royal household, was not a proper companion for a prince. Neither cared much, and thus far none of the adults had put a halt to their friendship. And so, it was that he had been here, building forts, throwing snowballs, and playing guards and bandits with Jarim. Then Joram was called to the boys to come watch the miracle of birth. The miracle of birth was actually pretty disgusting, Arthas thought. He hadn't realized there'd be so much goo involved. Brightmane grunted and heaved again, her legs held stiff and straight out. And with a sloshy, wet sound, her baby entered the world. Her heavy head thumped down into Arthas's lap. She closed her eyes for a moment. Her sides heaved as she caught her breath. The boy smiled, stroking the damp neck and thick, rough mane, and looked over to where Jarim and his father was attending to the foal. It was chilly in the stables at this time of year, and steam rose faintly from its warm, wet body. With a towel and dry hay, father and son rubbed off the last of the foal's unsettling shroud-like covering, and Arthas felt his face stretching with a grin. Damp, gray, all long tangled legs and big eyes. The foal looked around, blinking in the dim lantern lights. Those large brown eyes locked with Arthas's. "You're beautiful," Arthas thought, his breath stopping for a moment, and realized that the much-touted miracle of birth really was pretty miraculous. Brightmane began to struggle to her feet. Arthas leapt to his own, and pressed back against the wooden walls of the stable so the great animal could turn around without crushing him. Mother and newborn sniffed each other. Then Brightmane grunted and began to bathe her son with her long tongue. Lad, you're a bit worse for wear," said Joram. Arthas looked down at himself and his heart sank. He was covered in straw and horse spittle. Arthas shrugged. "Maybe I should jump into a snowbank on my way back to the palace," he offered, grinning sobering slightly. He said, "Don't worry, I'm 9 years old now. I'm no longer a baby. I can go where I—" There was a squawking of chickens and the sound of a man's booming voice, and Arthas's face fell. He squared his small shoulders, made an intense but ultimately ineffectual attempt at brushing off the straw, and strode out of the barn. "Sir Uther," he said in his best "I am the prince and you best remember it" voice. "These people have been kind to me. I pray you, don't go tramping into their poultry. Or their snapdragon beds," he thought, glancing over at the snow-covered piles of raised earth where the beautiful blooming flowers that were Vara Balnir's pride and joy would burst forth in a few short months. He heard Jorim and Jorim follow him out of the barn, but did not glance behind him. Instead, regarding the mounted knight, fully clad in armor. Arthas gasped. What happened? I'll explain on the way, Uther said grimly. I'll send someone back for your horse, Prince Arthas. Steadfast can travel faster even with two. He reached down, a large hand closing on Arthas's arm, and swung the boy up in front of him as he weighed nothing at all. Vara had come out of the house at the sound of a horse approaching at full gallop. She was wiping her hands off on a towel, and had a smudge of flour on her nose. Her blue eyes were wide as she looked over at her husband worriedly. Uther nodded politely to her. We'll discuss this later, Uther said. Ma'am. He touched his forehead with a mailed hand in courteous salute, then kicked his horse steadfast, armored as his rider was, and the beast leaped into action. Uther's arm was like a band of steel around Arthas's midsection. Fear bubbled up inside the boy, but he pushed it down even as he pushed on Uther's arm. I know how to ride, he said, his petulance covering up his worry. Tell me what is going on. A rider from South Shore has come and gone. He brings ill news. A few days ago, hundreds of small boats filled with refugees from Stormwind landed on our shores, Uther said. He did not remove his arm. Arthas gave up that particular struggle and craned his neck, listening intently. His sea-green eyes widened, fastened on Uther's grim face. Stormwind has fallen. What? Stormwind? How? To who? What? We'll find out. We'll find all that out shortly. The survivors, including Prince Varian, are being led by Stormwind's one-time champion, Lord Anduin Lothar. He, Prince Varian, and others will be coming to Capital City in a few days. Lothar has warned us he bears alarming news. Obvious enough, if something has destroyed Stormwind. I was sent to find you and bring you back. You have no business playing with the common folk at this moment. Stunned, Arthas turned and faced forward again, his hands gripping Steadfast's mane. Stormwind. He had never been there, but had heard tales about it. It was a mighty place, with great stone walls, beautiful buildings. It had been built with sturdiness in mind, to withstand the buffeting of the fierce winds from which it had taken its name. To think that it had fallen. Who or what could be strong enough to take such a city? How many people came with them? He asked, pitching his voice louder than he really wished to, in order to be heard over the drumming of the horses' hooves as they headed back towards the city. Unknown. Not a small number, that much is certain. The messenger said it was everyone who had survived. Survived what? And Prince Varian? He heard of Varian all of his life, of course, just as he knew all the names of the neighboring kings, queens, princes, and princesses. Suddenly, his eyes widened. Uther had mentioned Varian, but not the prince's father, King Lane. Will soon become King Varian. King Lane fell with Stormwind. This news of a single tragedy hit Arthas harder than the thought of thousands of people suddenly rendered homeless. Arthas's own family was close-knit. He, his sister Kalia, his mother Queen Leanne, and of course King Tyrannus. He'd seen how some rulers behaved with their families, and he knew that his was remarkable in degree of closeness. To have lost your city, your way of life, and your father. Poor Varian, he said, quick tears of sympathy coming to his eyes. Uther patted his shoulder awkwardly. Aye, he said, it is a dark day for the boy. Arthas shivered suddenly, and not from the cold of a bright winter's day. The beautiful afternoon, with its blue sky and softly curving, snow-draped landscape, had suddenly darkened for him. A few days later, Arthas was standing up on the castle ramparts, keeping Falric one of the guards company and handing him a steaming hot mug of tea. Such a visit, like the ones Arthas paid to the Balnier family and the castle's scullery maids and valets and blacksmiths, and indeed nearly every underling on the royal grounds, was not unusual. Taranis always sighed, but Arthas knew that no one was ever punished for speaking with him, and indeed he sometimes wondered if his father secretly approved. Falric smiled gratefully, and bowed deeply in genuine respect, pulling off his gauntlets so the mug would warm his cold hands. Snow threatened, and the sky was a pale gray, but thus far the weather was clear. Arthas leaned against the wall, resting his chin on his folded arms. He looked out over the rolling white hills of Tirisfal, down the road that led through Silver Pine Forest to South Shore, the road along which Anduin Lothar, the mage Khadgar, and Prince Varian would be traveling. Any sign of them? Nay, your highness, Falric answered, sipping the hot beverage. It could be today, tomorrow, or the day after. If you're hoping to catch a glimpse, sir, you may be waiting a while. Arthas shot him a grin, his eyes crinkling with mirth. Better than lessons, he said. Well, sir, you'd know that better than I would, Falric said diplomatically, clearly fighting the impulse to grin back. While the guard finished the tea, Arthas sighed and looked back down the road, as he had a dozen times before. This had been exciting at first, but now he was becoming bored. He wanted to go back and find out how Bratmane's Foal was, and began wondering how difficult it would be to slip away for a few hours and not be missed. Falric was right. Lothar and Varian might be a few days away, if Arthas blinked. He slowly lifted his chin from his hands and narrowed his eyes. They're coming, he cried, pointing. Falric was at his side immediately, the mug forgotten. He nodded. Sharp eyes, Prince Arthas. Marwyn, he called. Another soldier snapped to attention. Go tell the king that Lothar and Varian are on the way. They should be here within the hour. Aye, Captain, the younger man said, saluting. I'll do it, I'll go, said Arthas, already moving as he spoke. Marwyn hesitated, glancing back at his superior officer, but Arthas was determined to beat him. He raced down the steps, slipping on ice and having to jump the rest of the way, and ran through the courtyard, skidding to a halt as he approached the throne room and barely remembering to compose himself. Today was when Taranis met with the representatives of the populace, to listen to their concerns and do what he could to assist them. Arthas flipped back the hood of his beautifully embroidered red runecloth cape. He took a deep breath, letting it escape his lips as soft mist, and nodded as he approached the two guards, who saluted sharply and turned to push the doors open for him. The throne room was significantly warmer than outside the courtyard. Even though it was a large chamber formed of marble and stone, with a high domed ceiling. Even on overcast days such as this one, the octagonal window at the apex of the dome let in plenty of natural light. Torches in their sconces burned steadily on the walls, adding both warmth and an orange tint to the room. An intricate design of circles enclosing the seal of Lordaeron graced the floor, hidden now by the gathering of people respectfully awaiting their turn to address their liege. Seated in the jeweled throne on a tiered dais was King Tyrannus II. His fair hair was touched with a crown only at the temples, and his face was slightly lined, with more smile lines than the creased frowns that etched their marks on souls as well as visages. He wore a beautifully tailored robe in hues of blue and purple, wrought with gleaming gold embroidery that caught the torchlight and glinted off his crown. Tyrannus leaned forward slightly, engrossed in what the man who stood before him, a lesser noble, whose name Arthas couldn't recall at the moment, was saying. His eyes, blue-green and intent, were focused on the man. For a moment, knowing whose coming he was about to announce, Arthas simply stood looking at his father. He, like Varian, was the son of a king, a prince of the blood, but Varian had no father, not anymore, and Arthas felt a lump rise in his throat at the thought of seeing that throne empty, of hearing the ancient song of coronation sung for him. By the light, please let that day be a long, long time away. Perhaps feeling the intensity of his son's gaze, Tyrannus glanced over at the door. His eyes crinkled in a smile for a moment. Then he returned his attention to the petitioner. Arthas cleared his throat and stepped forward. Pardon the interruption, Father. They're coming. I saw them. They should be here within the hour. Tyrannus sobered slightly. He knew who they were. He nodded. Thank you, my son. Those assembled looked at one another. Most of them, too, knew who they were, and they moved as if to end the meeting. Tyrannus held up a hand. Nay, the weather holds and the road is clear. They will arrive when they do, and not a moment before. Until then, let us continue. He smiled ruefully. I have a feeling that once they come, audiences such as this will need to be tabbled. Let us finish as much business as we can before that moment. Arthas looked at his father with pride. This was why people loved Tyrannus so much, and why the king usually turned a blind eye to his sons adventuring among the common folk. Tyrannus cared deeply about the people he ruled, and had instilled that sentiment in his son. Shall I ride out to meet them, father? Tyrannus scrutinized his son for a moment, then shook his fair head. No, I think it best if you do not attend this meeting. Arthas felt like he had been struck. Not attend? He was 9 years old. Something very bad happened to an important ally, and a boy not much older than he had been rendered fatherless by it. He felt a sudden flash of anger. Why did his father insist on sheltering him so? Why was he not allowed to attend important meetings? He bit back the retort that would have sprung to his lips had he been alone with Tyrannus. It would not do to argue with his father here in front of all these people. Even if he was totally and completely in the right on this, he took a deep breath, bowed, and left. An hour later, Arthas Menethil was safely ensconced in one of the many balconies that overlooked the throne room. He grinned to himself. He was still small enough to hide under the seats if anyone poked their nose in for a quick perusal. He fidgeted slightly. Another year or two and he wouldn't be able to do this. But in a year or two, surely father will understand that I deserve to be present at such events, and I won't have to hide. The thought pleased him. He rolled up his coat and used it as a pillow while he waited. The room was warm from braziers, torches, and the heat of many bodies in one small place. The heat and the soothing murmur of voices in normal discussion lulled him, and he almost fell asleep. Your Majesty, powerful, resonant, and strong, jerked Arthas awake. I am Anduin Lothar, a knight of Stormwind. They were here. Lord Anduin Lothar, the one-time champion of Stormwind. Arthas edged from under the seat and rose carefully, making sure he was hidden behind the blue curtain that draped the box, and peeked out. Lothar looked every inch the warrior. Arthas thought as he regarded the man. Tall, powerfully built, he wore heavy armor with an ease that indicated he was well accustomed to his weight. Although his upper lip and jaw sported a thick mustache and a short beard, his head was almost bald. What hair he had left had been tied back in a small ponytail. Beside him stood an old man in violet robes. Arthas's gaze fell on the boy who could only be Prince Varian Wrynn. Tall, slender yet, but with broad shoulders that promised the slim frame would one day fill out. He looked pale and exhausted. Arthas winced as he regarded the youth, a few years older than he, looking lost, alone, and frightened. When addressed, Varian recovered and gave the polite, requisite replies. Taranis was an old hand at knowing how to make people feel comfortable. Quickly he dismissed all but a few courtiers and guards and rose from his throne to greet the visitors. "Please, be seated," he said, choosing not to sit in the glorious throne as was his right, but instead perching on the top stair of the dais. He drew Varian down beside him in a fatherly gesture. Arthas smiled. Hidden away, the young Prince of Lordaeron watched and listened closely, and the voices that floated up to him spoke words that sounded almost fanciful. Yet, as he regarded this mighty warrior of Stormwind, and even more, as he studied the wan visage of the future king of such a magnificent realm, Arthas realized with a creeping feeling that none of this was fantasy. All of it was deathly real, and it was terrifying. The men gathered spoke of creatures called orcs that had somehow infested Azeroth. Huge, green, with tusks for teeth and lusting for blood, they had formed a horde that flowed like a seemingly unstoppable tide, enough to cover the land from shore to shore, Lothar said direly. It was these monsters that had attacked Stormwind and made refugees, or corpses, Arthas realized of his denizens. Things got heated when some courtier or other clearly didn't believe Lothar. Lothar's temper rose, but Taranis diffused the situation and brought the meeting to a close. "I will summon my neighboring kings," he said. "These events concern us all, Your Majesty. I offer you my home and my protection for as long as you shall need it." Arthas smiled. Varian was going to stay here, in the palace, with him. It would be nice to have another noble boy to play with. He got along well enough with Kalia, who was 2 years his elder. But, well, she was a girl, and while he was fond of Jeriam, he knew that their opportunities to play together were perforce limited. Varian, however, was a prince of the blood, just like Arthas, and they could spar together and riding and go exploring. "You're telling us to prepare for war." His father's voice cut in on his thoughts with brutal efficiency, and Arthas's mood grew somber again. "Yes," Lothar replied. "A war for the very survival of our race." Arthas swallowed hard, then left the viewing box as silently as he had come. As Arthas had expected, a short time later, Prince Varian was shown into the guest quarters. Taranis himself accompanied the boy, resting a hand gently on the youth's shoulder. As if he was surprised to see his son waiting in the guest quarters, he did not show it. "Arthas, This is Prince Varian Wrynn, future King of Stormwind. Arthas bowed to his equal. Your Highness, he said formally, I bid you welcome to Lordaeron. I only wish the circumstances were happier. Varian returned the bow gracefully. As I told King Tyrannus, I am grateful for your support and friendship during these difficult times. His voice was stiff, strained, weary. Arthas took in the cape, tunic, and breeches made of rune cloth and mageweave, and beautifully embroidered. It looked as though Varian had been wearing them for half his life. So dirty were they. His face had clearly been scrubbed, but those were traces of dirt at his temples and beneath his nails. I will send up one of the servants shortly with food and towels, hot water and a tub, so that you may refresh yourself, Prince Varian. Tyrannus continued. Tyrannus continued to use the boy's title. That would wear off with time. But Arthas understood why the king emphasized it now. Varian needed to keep hearing that he will still be respected, still royal, when he had lost absolutely everything but his life. Varian pressed his lips together and nodded. Thank you, he managed. Arthas, I leave him in your care. Tyrannus squeezed Varian's shoulder reassuringly, then departed, closing the door. The two boys stared at each other. Arthas's mind was a total blank. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Arthas blurted, I'm sorry about your father. Varian winced and turned away, walking toward the huge windows that overlooked Lordaeron Lake. The snow had been threatening all morning, was finally coming, drifting slowly downward to cover the land with a silent blanket. It was too bad. On a clear day, you could see all the way to Fenris Keep. Thank you. I'm sure he died fighting nobly and gave us good as he got. He was assassinated. Varian's voice was blunt and emotionless. Arthas whirled to look at him, shocked. His features, in profile to Arthas now, lit by the cold light of a winter's day, were unnaturally composed. Only his eyes, bloodshot and brown, filled with pain, seemed alive. A trusted friend managed to get him to speak with her alone. Then she killed him, stabbed him right in the heart. Arthas stared. Death in glorious battle was difficult enough to handle, but this? Impulsively, he placed a hand on the other prince's arm. I saw a foal being born yesterday, he said. It sounded inane, but it was the first thing that sprang to his mind as he spoke earnestly. When the weather lets up, I'll take you to see him. He's the most amazing thing. Varian turned toward him and gazed at him for a long moment. Emotions flitted across his face. Offense, disbelief, gratitude, yearning, understanding. Suddenly the brown eyes filled with tears, and Varian looked away. He folded his arms and hunched in on himself, his shoulders shaking with sobs as he did his best to muffle. They came out anyway, harsh, racking sounds of mourning for a father, a kingdom, a way of life that he probably hadn't been able to grieve until this precise minute. Arthas squeezed his arm, and it felt rigid as stone beneath his fingers. I hate winter, Varian sobbed, as the depth of his hurt conveyed by those three simple words. A seeming non-sequitur humbled Arthas, unable to watch such raw pain, yet powerless to do anything about it. He dropped his hand, turned away, and stared out the window. Outside, the snow continued to fall.